Good morning. Today I want to talk about something very tragic, and that is the horrific crash that happened last night, January 29th, 2025, between a passenger airplane and a military helicopter over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. This won't be a long presentation, but it will show you some of the astrology above that was mirrored by the tragedy below. So let's see if I can share my screen. And I just need to get rid of a few panels so I can see what I'm doing here. Hold on. And I think I'm ready to go. So this is air tragedy over the Potomac. Now, perhaps it's because I recently flew on a passenger airplane, or perhaps it's simply the sheer magnitude of the accident. Either way, the January 29th, 2025 crash between a passenger plane and military helicopter leaves me filled with both horror and sorrow. However, as a mundane astrologer, I feel obligated to examine the transits, the country chart, and a chart for the state or city in which the event occurred. Usually when I do this, I'll find something in the cycles above that mirrors the sorrow below. Now, according to the news media, the crash happened at about 9 p.m. on January 29th, 2025 in Washington, District of Columbia. So that is when my transit chart is erected for. For America, I usually use the July 2nd, 1776 chart for the passage of the Declaration of Independence. But July 4th chart would work just as well. And for Washington, D.C., I set up a chart for noon on February 27th, 1801. This is the date on which Congress officially created the District of Columbia as we know it today by passing the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1801. Okay, if we look at the transit chart, the most obvious thing we see is a square between Mars and Chiron. This suggests a heightened risk of wounding Chiron through accident or aggression, Mars, that could take place somewhere in the world. This aspect was 1 degree 36 minutes from exact, and the square will be exact on February 3rd. So we're still within a period when accidents or wounding or aggression can happen in the world, and something may happen somewhere else. The question is, in this case, why America and why Washington, D.C.? Now, in the transits to our chart for America, we see a conjunction between transiting Chiron over here and natal Chiron that will be exact on February 17th. I have exact on twice. Sorry about that. Always a typo somewhere. And we have a square between transiting Mars and natal Chiron that will be exact on February 1st. So this happens very soon. And these aspects create a heightened risk of wounding for the country, which can happen through politics, natural disasters, accidents, or aggression, just to name a few. Those are just a few of the possibilities. So the chance of wounding is represented by the conjunction of transiting Chiron with natal Chiron. And the square for Mars right now, which is almost exact on February 1st, it acts on as a trigger. And Mars can represent, uh, accidents or aggression. And in the past, when we have had Chiron returns, such as this one, transiting Chiron conjunct natal Chiron, we've often gotten a lot of political wounding. But we can also get wounding here and there through, as I said, natural disasters, accidents, as in this case, or aggression. And the square from Mars just provides some further timing for when the risk will be greatest. Okay, now if we look at the transits to the DC chart, I have CC again. Sorry about the typos. I'll fix that later, but I don't want to restart this presentation. And looking at the transits to the DC chart, the first thing we see is that transiting Chiron up here, representing wounding, is semi-square. And a semi-square is an aspect which can represent a turning point or a breaking point. Nothing necessarily has to happen, but there is a greater chance of some sort of sudden breaking at this point in time. And transiting Chiron is semi-square both Mars, which can represent accidents, and Pluto, the planet of death and transformation, right over here. Okay, so that by itself is increasing the risk of this kind of accident, wounding, accidents, death. Furthermore, transiting Chiron is conjunct the Mars Pluto midpoint. It's very close. You see that down here. It's within 4 minutes of arc of being exact. But we have more. Transiting Mars is, let's see, transiting Mars is over here. It is opposite the Pluto Chiron midpoint in this chart for Washington, D.C. So here's transiting Mars. Here's Pluto and Chiron. Mars is opposite that midpoint. At this point, it's like a double whammy. Notice the same planets are involved. Up here we had Chiron, Mars, and Pluto. And here we have Chiron, Mars, and Pluto. So that is really like an exclamation point on these things, with Chiron representing wounding, Mars representing accidents, Pluto representing death. But then in addition to that, if we look at midpoints between the transiting planets, we see that natal Mars in the chart for Washington, D.C., that's going to be right here. It is conjunct the midpoint between transiting Mars and transiting Chiron. So that is like a triple whammy that made these tragic events all the much more likely. And you can look up here and see transiting Mars, natal Mars, transiting Chiron, transiting Pluto. They're all involved in multiple aspects and midpoint configurations. And then natal Chiron in the Washington, D.C. chart is over here. So this triple whammy really made this kind of event much more likely. Okay. Now that is the last chart, so the last slide, so let me stop sharing. Okay, here I'm back. Now, if I looked at all this beforehand, would I have looked at all those semi-squares and midpoint configurations and what was happening in the transit chart, application to the USA chart to Washington, D.C.? Would I have looked at all of that and said, clearly, a passenger airplane is going to collide with a military helicopter? No, I wouldn't. Though, again, it's interesting that Mars represents not only accidents, but military. So uh, I note that the accident involved a military helicopter. But I would not have looked at all that beforehand and said, well, definitely this is what is going to happen. Because that is not the way astrology works. Even if people in the public believe that's the way it works, and maybe even some astrologers think that's the way it works. But that is not the way it works. Astrology is more like quantum physics. In quantum physics, for instance, before we make a measurement, before something happens, we don't know the actual position of an electron. All we have is this wave, this probability curve, which gives us the probability that when we do our measurement, that the electron will be found here, or over here, or someplace else. It's exactly the same with astrology. Before the event happens, all we know is that there are heightened risks or probabilities for certain types of events to occur. And the planets and the signs and the aspects, they tell us something about what the nature of the event might be, but we don't know for certain exactly what the event will be, exactly what will happen. But after the fact, we can often look at the horoscopes, at the charts, and we can see how well the event fits in with the astrology, with the cycles above. And in many instances, well, some things in astrology may work through actual known physics, like sunspots disrupting the geomagnetic field around the earth and causing more disease or more problems for people. But these days, I suspect, and I'll probably talk about this in another video, that a lot of astrology happens not due to physics, but due to mathematics. In particular, I've noted that there are Fibonacci-like processes that govern the passage of the universe through time. Just as in a Fibonacci sequence, you add the previous two terms together to get the next term. So in our universe, we could say information about the past plus combined with information about the present gives us information about the future. And then the future becomes the new present, and the previous present becomes the new past, and it goes over and over again. And this kind of process, this Fibonacci-like process, we expect it to create a fractal-like universe where the cycles above are mirrored by the events below. It's not that one causes the other, it's that both are caused by the mathematics involved. And thus, through analyzing the cycles above, we can understand the cycles and events that are happening at our level. Anyway, that is my theory about how perhaps not all, but a lot of astrology works. And I'll probably talk about that in some future videos. But today is not the time to go into that. Today is a time to grieve, and a time for sorrow, and a time to remember and reflect on the tragic loss of life. So for now, I'll just say so long, and I'll let you and let myself continue with the grieving over these tragic events. So long.